A normal, everyday day. All the people were going about their business, except this day was 7 years ago. It was on that beautiful day that the world changed forever. It went down in history as the breakthrough to the underground. That day took the lives of thousands of innocent people. Some lost their parents, and some lost their children. But there were families like that, who remained forever in history and in people's memory, a bright flash of light. That day, Jin lost everything in an instant. He vowed through tears of blood that one day he would become a hunter and tear monsters to shreds. In memory of those who died that day, people created a memorial. Survivors came here to remember the days and times. In the 7 years since the apocalypse, Jin joined the Hunter Academy, from which he was eventually expelled. And he was expelled from the academy for one simple reason. He couldn't keep up with the others. In other words, he wasn't awakened. A normal awakened person needs a few months to complete their training at the Hunter Training Center, and Jin has spent over 6 years at this academy with little to no progress. The administration couldn't allow a student like Jin to study with them. After all, it would really tarnish the image of the entire academy. Jin was extremely hardworking compared to the other students. He had been coming to the training room before dawn every morning for 6 years. Not to mention unlocking unique characteristics and acquiring skills. Not even basic stats have increased. There was a mom and her daughter nearby, discussing her father's death. The girl thought her daddy was a hero. After all, he was the fearless one who fought the monsters to the very end. As suddenly, the mom asked the girl, "What should you do if you get difficulties in life?" To which the little girl replied that you have to be brave and not give up until the end. These words left a huge imprint on Jin's mind. Those words gave Jin the idea that he shouldn't give up, even if no one believed in him, because if he gives up now, then all 6 years of academy training will have been for nothing. In the horrible pouring rain, Jin ran for hours, and all to meet with the curator. Jin asked his former handler for help. He wouldn't even listen to him. And then Jin said, "Don't you understand? I can't just give up. Please help me pass the exam." The curator was clearly not happy about this late visit. Holding back his rage, he said, "Hey, you idiot! You don't get it! Nobody's gonna give you your money back. I won't even give you half the money you spent." But it wasn't about the money spent. Jin just wanted to be a monster hunter, for the sake of his family. But the curator wouldn't even listen to him. With all his anger, he punched Jin right in the face, hoping it would calm him down. And again, another door of opportunity closed in front of Jin. If he also had some unique characteristic, things might have been different, or at least a modicum of talent. With his work ethic, it would at least bear some fruit. Then things would have been very different. The others didn't consider him the dregs of society. As suddenly, Jin receives a notification saying that the Tower of Trials praises him for his iron will. So, what's it all mean? But no sooner had one problem been solved. Jin started drowning in a small puddle. Drowning, Jin screamed at the top of his voice for help. This made the curator even angrier. But once outside, the curator saw nothing. No Jin, no nothing. Jin had just vanished without a trace. All that's left of Jin is just a cap in a dumpster. Meanwhile, Jin was sinking deeper and deeper. It was as if he were being devoured by the sea.
There was less and less air left. The pressure was such that it felt like someone was trying to get out through my eyes.
Finally reaching the bottom, Jin began to fall again. But this time at least he could breathe. At that moment, he was filled with real terror. And again, a notice appeared saying that the test tower had selected all of Earth's suitable candidates. Would the second catastrophe begin today? But before he started, Jin had to choose a difficulty level. And the reward he would receive would depend on the difficulty he chose. Not knowing what to do, his intuition told him to take this chance. After selecting the difficulty level, Jin began to fall into the abyss again. And in the distance, a woman's voice said, "We hope that you will get a satisfactory result from the suffering you have received. You will soon enter the first floor of the Tower of Trials," whatever it all means. Apparently, Jin's only pain lies ahead. Before the trials began, the system healed all of Jin's status ailments and injuries. And on the first floor, a vast desert awaited him. To pass the first level, the genie was given a very ordinary sword. It looks very heavy, and it's strong. I think the genie will have to use it more than once in this place. And the theme of the first challenge will be survival. Most importantly, the reward for completing this level will be the unlocking of a unique characteristic. Would he really get what he had worked so hard to get for the last 6 years of his life? It sounded too good to be true, but if it was madness. But first of all, the genie still had to survive. Before Jin could draw his sword, the ground beneath his feet came to life. and that meant the ordeal had begun. Because Jin chose the highest level when choosing the difficulty, at the very beginning he will face the incredible challenges, the first of which was the sand golem. It's a victory if Jin can survive for 10 minutes. That sounds a lot easier than it is. Grabbing my sword, the only true solution at that point seemed to be to just run away. But you can't run away from a monster like that. But the fact that if Jin didn't make it through this ordeal, he would die added to the thrill. To attack a sand golem with absolutely no powers, it would be suicide. So all Genie had to do was run away from him. But the golem was much faster than the Genie had expected. Made it even more difficult. The desert, or rather the sand in it. And with Jin's stamina, running 9 minutes without stopping is impossible. And then, Jin began to think of another plan. The only thing he'd been given was the sword, which means there's not much of a choice. Or he'd die trying to escape, or he'd die fighting, both of which were horrible. But if he died fighting, he died with honor, thanks to the great theoretical knowledge he'd gained at Hunter's School. Jin knew that a golem could be immobilized by destroying its core. However, the core is usually in hard-to-reach places, and if so, Jin decided to make it easily accessible. Climbing up the huge sand hill, Jin replaced the golem in the trap. For on the other side, a steep cliff awaited them. Jin suspected that the other side might be waiting for them, so he was prepared for it. Unlike the golem, now is the perfect time to finish him off, because a huge monster like the sand golem will take a long time to get back on its feet, which means he's vulnerable. And there it is, the blow that guarantees the Genie survival during the first trial. Only the cannonball was much stronger than he thought. And with this blow, he only managed to nick it. Yeah, well, one hit like that should be enough. All we have to do is hit the rift. The Genie was seconds away from winning this fight, and Golem, in turn, took him down, breaking half his bones. But even so, Jin wasn't going to give up for nothing, especially when his own life was at stake. Gathering his remaining strength into a fist, he was ready to fight to his last breath. When suddenly, Jin threw his sword and shouted, "Shut up!" I said, "Shut up." And this time, the sword did the trick. The golem's core was destroyed, which means Jin was able to survive. More importantly, he completed the irradiation test. At the end of this battle, Jin realized two things. The first was to never relax, and the second was to never give up. Even if it seems like there's no way out, you have to fight to the last man. Jin still couldn't believe that a loser like him could defeat a sand golem. All his life, he thought he was incapable of anything. But it turned out he wasn't. He survived and was able to pass the first stage of the trial. As promised, he was rewarded with a unique characteristic. As an additional reward, he received the fast recovery skill and an additional 500 experience points. Jin couldn't believe it. He had put so much effort into the last 6 years. The only thing he got in return was scorn and ridicule. And as a reward for winning the first challenge, Jin received the unique characteristic of necromancy. Now he can become a hunter too. However, this will only happen if the Genie manages to survive in this tower. When suddenly, something strange appeared in front of the Genie. It looked like a sphere, or a blob of energy. But one thing was certain. It was extremely powerful. A black mist appeared where the sand golem died. By touching him, Jin activated his unique characteristic of necromancy, is an ability that allows you to absorb the souls of the dead. And after the golem's death, the game offered to absorb his soul, not understanding how his ability worked. Jin agreed to absorb the golem's soul without a second thought. When he absorbed her, Jin immediately felt a change inside himself. And the system informed him that he could only absorb 5 souls. With the souls absorbed, Jin can increase his stats. With the absorption, Golem Jin's soul increased his strength by 3 points and his stamina by 2 points. Jin had never felt anything like this before. The sensation was like a liter of adrenaline. His body was filled with crazy energy. The idea that after 6 years of grueling training he could achieve absolutely no results was still not in his mind. And here, by killing just one monster, he was able to acquire a unique characteristic and strengthen his stats. Before Jin could get excited, a portal to the next level appeared in front of him, but he had no choice but to move on. As soon as Jin took the first step into the portal, he immediately collapsed exhausted. His wounds were worse than he thought, and then Jin felt a cutting pain in each of his broken bones. After a few seconds of incredible pain, Jin's wounds healed. He thought his body would heal after each trial was over. The place his portal brought him to was the waiting room, a place where the subjects could rest. While resting, Jin was thinking about why he was in the tower and whether he would ever be able to get out of it. After a couple minutes, the genie gets the in-game notification again. Now has 5 new teams available to him. Information, store, community, inventory, challenge, which he can activate by speaking a command. But he didn't have time to go through all that. Gene didn't have time. His main concern now was survival, and the second trial will begin exactly 24 hours after the end of the first. So there is still time to rest. As suddenly, the genie started receiving hundreds of messages from the community. Apparently with the community, it's like a chat room. Judging from the posts, it looks like it's just regular people. But after, literally 10 seconds, the chat was blocked by the administrator. The administrator had important information that he could only share with those who had passed the training test. The administrator said that the experience points they got for completing the training are in-game currency, without which you can't even get water. Points can be exchanged between players, but you can only earn new points during challenges. The fact that Jin can't get water without points means that in order to earn survival points, he needs to pass as many trials as possible. The rules are very clear. But surviving here is going to be incredibly difficult. And Jin's dream of becoming a hunter was getting farther away by the second. Jin began to think of a plan of action and realized that he couldn't get out of here alive with just his sword. And then Jin remembered he had access to the store. All the hunters lost all their skills when they hit the tower. But it should be easier for them to learn skills they had previously mastered. And Jin realized he wasn't on the same starting line as them. And if he didn't train, there was no way he would be able to catch up with them. Jin spent the entire allotted time practicing his skills. In the meantime, he'd hurt himself pretty badly. But thanks to the healing effects of the waiting room, he has no problem practicing 24 hours a day. Well, after a workout like this, you need to replenish your energy levels. But Jin, he stocked up on weapons before he thought about food. And to buy food, he only has 40 experience points left. And meanwhile, it was only 15 minutes until the second test began. The time flew by without a second thought, but the only question on Jin's mind was whether he could survive this time. Even though he had bought all the necessary items for the battle, but whether he'd have the skill, there's no telling. But no matter what, Jin was determined not to give up, not even at the risk of death. Behold, the time has come for the second test of the tower. This time, Jin found himself in a bush forest, and the purpose of this ordeal was murder. But to kill, you had to kill the leader of an orc tribe, all within a limited time frame. Now what? They had to look for the tribe. I mean, the system teleported Jin right to their camp, but getting to the chief and killing him would not be easy. Made this task even more difficult by the camp's guards, of the tribe's finest warriors. Usually, in dungeons, if the orc tribe has guards, you should expect hunters as well. Jin wasn't sure he could defeat even one hunter. The problem was that there were too many orcs. To defeat an entire tribe, hunters of at least E rank must form a squad. It is almost impossible to do it alone. Jin decided to temporarily back off, to come up with some kind of plan. And then, Jin remembered a very interesting life hack that would help him pass the test. Having gathered all the necessary components, it was time to start executing the plan. Although orcs look like lazy pigs, they are a pretty industrious race, with their own culture and customs. And they're hunters. They always go hunting early in the morning, and come back by sundown, so Jin has plenty of time. Breaking through a whole crowd of orcs is the hardest part of the challenge. However, fire will be able to assist the genie in this. Like all living things, orcs are afraid of fire. According to the Hunters Association, orc guards don't always stand guard. They return to the village to eat or rest, and this is the perfect moment to create a diversion and wreak real havoc on the camp. If the fire completely engulfs the village, the genie doesn't have to worry about encountering hunters returning from the hunt. But before that can happen, you need to kill at least 2 orc laborers. It's easier than taking a lollipop from a baby. The chanting orc worker has absolutely no combat abilities whatsoever. By killing an orc, Jin had his soul, and with it his powers. A necromancy skill can be much more useful than it might seem at first glance. Together, with the absorption of the orc's soul, Jin's skill increased by a full 9%. But something happened that Jin was trying so hard to avoid. An encounter with an orc guard. These orcs have much better physical strength, which means they can kill. But thanks to the experience points Jin gained from his first mission, he was able to purchase a shield, and that purchase had already paid off.
It took a little bit of work, but in the end, the orc guard was dead.
And by absorbing his soul, Jin has increased his stats even more, which is the best thing to do in this situation. The entire orc settlement was in chaos. Fire was destroying their homes and their lives. And this is the best time to go after the leader. when they reached the remains of the camp. Jin saw that the chief was guarded by only 5 orcs. If Jin is careful with the orc guards, he will have no problem defeating the chieftain. Thanks to the absorption of the guard's soul, the orc workers pose absolutely no threat to the genie. He killed one orc after another, sparing absolutely no one. Of course, he met resistance inside the camp, but even that could not stop Jin. The guard separated from the chief, leaving him alone. It turns out this guard is the last obstacle in Jin's path to survival. Now, Jin is left alone with the leader of the orc tribe. Even though the chief is physically weak, but that doesn't mean he's not a threat, because tribal leaders have magical powers, capable of wiping any human being off the face of the earth. But the chief shouldn't underestimate Jin either. He may be an ordinary man, but he has knowledge. That allows him to win. By withstanding such an attack, Jin got the achievement of one who withstands fire, and with it, a new ability called Fire Resistance. It reduces the damage received from fire. Now, killing the chief is Jin's principal business. It's not even about accomplishing the mission. It's not about survival. It's all about excitement. Once you've tasted the power, you'll never forget what it feels like. But Jin felt that just dying was too easy. He decided that the last moments of the orc leader's life should introduce him to the real pain of hell. Well, once inside the tent, Jin saw something he didn't expect. The bleeding chief was embraced by his terrified children. One of them even tried to beg for his father's life. Orcs seemed to be capable of feeling love too. At that moment, Jin was plagued by doubts. Not doubts, but conscience. He would kill the chief anyway, because his own life would depend on it, and the promise he made to himself and his family. As suddenly, one of the chief's children drew his dagger and tried to kill Jin. Of course, Jin's reaction was enough to fend off the attack. The will to kill a child. An orc, but a child. He didn't have, but remembering the anger and rage with which the monsters had killed his family. Jin quickly changed his mind, and slaughtered the entire orc family. The second test has been passed. Too bad. But he can't continue fighting with this shield any longer. But it has to be said, it's because of him that Jin was able to survive. Of those who could pass the first trial, only half could survive the second. When suddenly Jin saw that one of the survivors had posted in the chat room that he was looking for information on how to get home. Jin couldn't believe his eyes. He was sure that the only way to get back to Earth was to go through all the levels of the tower. In the community chat room, the players naturally came to a consensus that they should all share the information they gather through questions. And all the players came to the conclusion that upon reaching level 5, they would be able to purchase temporary return stones that would allow them to return to Earth for a few days. And starting at level 8, they'll be given access to an enhanced version of the system, and the ability to purchase an item that can send them back to Earth forever, to come home alive. That's what everyone in the tower wanted. But Jin didn't know if he could return to Earth while leaving his powers behind. But it's too early to think about that. After all, Jin is only at the 2nd level right now. The 8th level is still so far away. So Jin decided to look at the situation from a different angle. Previously, all of his stats were at rock bottom. Now they were approaching 20, and before beginning the next challenge, Jin decided to absorb a few more souls, considering he almost died last time. Consuming the remaining souls, he felt a wild and unbridled power never before known. He's finally realized what it's like to transcend human limits. The laws of physics, literally acting differently on him. But once you have that power, you have to learn how to control it. But all this comes with experience. It takes a little time for the body to get used to the new possibilities. And since there wasn't much time left until the 3rd challenge, Jin decided to buy some new items. With his experience points, Jin bought a sword of black steel, an assassin's cloak, and a shield of dead wood. But before heading to the 3rd challenge, Jin decided to try out his new items. If the other players were fighting towers to survive, Jin was only doing it to become stronger than ever, and the 3rd challenge was called a duel. It was clear from the name that it would be a one-on-one fight, but what was most alarming was the location the system had chosen for the duel. Specifically, a cave. They can be inhabited by all sorts of monsters. A few seconds later, a notification popped up informing me that the Guardian of Darkness would appear in 5 seconds. But as soon as the timer stopped, nothing happened. That made it all the more terrifying, for the passion could strike at any moment, when suddenly all of Jin's reflexes sharpened. But he didn't have time to react. The Guardian of Darkness wounded him first. Luckily, the wound was not fatal. That monster's name was Doppelganger, one of the cunning Guardians of Darkness. In a fight with him, you should expect absolutely everything. But the darkness in which the Doppelganger hides makes it even more difficult. But despite the monster's significant advantage, Jin wasn't about to give up. If Jin hadn't turned around at the last second, the doping machine would have sliced his spine in two, and thanks to the quick recovery skill, Jin was able to heal his wound. Watching the guard, Jin couldn't help but notice that he was completely mimicking him. Well, if he's completely copying his moves, we need to make sure he can't do that, and Jin did it perfectly. With the speed he attacked the Guardian, the monster simply didn't have time to copy. Great! Jin has managed to seriously injure him, but that's hardly the end of it. Shadow guards, also known for their wild regeneration due to their absorption of darkness. In other words, as long as Scary is in the cave, it will be extremely difficult to kill him. Just as Jin thought, this monster is copying his every move, so dodging him like that will be easy enough. In which case, Jin has the advantage, because he knows how to counter his own techniques. Jin sprinkling the monster with a barrage of attacks, cornering it. In the course of this attack, the guard managed to catch Jin's throat. Though the wound was not fatal, but it threw Jin off balance for a while, and the Guardian seized the moment to counterattack. But this time, his blows were much faster and heavier. It was clearly a mismatch in the time that they fought. The monster was able to evolve, which means the longer the battle lasts, the less chance Jin has of victory. That's when he decided to pull his trump out of his sleeve. The cloak that Jin bought in the break room when activated increases his movement speed by 15%. Don't forget that there wasn't a lot of time to complete this mission, and Jin has exactly 1 minute to kill the guard. If he doesn't make it, he dies, even with increased speed. Reaching the Guardian was not such an easy task. However, thanks to the combat experience he earned at the academy, Jin still managed to wound the monster. By the looks of it, it's going to be fatal early on. However, it's too early to relax. Damn! Even with Jin's speed, the Guardian was able to take away his arm, but it wasn't over. The most important thing now was not to lose control, because if Jin could kill the monster in the allotted time, he could get his hand back. Meanwhile, the sentinel stood motionless. But it didn't look like he was dead. Even though he has the recovery skill, it looks like he needs time to recover from Jin's last attack. This is his last chance to kill him, but the sword was too far away. Fortunately, the increased speed would still be in effect for 11 seconds. The likelihood of success is slim to none. It's like he was grasping at straws. But it's better to take the risk than to wait for death. To ram the monster with your shield. That's the best thing Jin can do right now. Great! The genie was able to attack the monster before it fully recovered. Now all you have to do is keep ramming it, until the cloak's effects wear off. I have to admit, that attack did incredible damage to the monster. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to kill it, but there's still time for Jin to finish it off. With his account, Jin separated the monster's head from its body. No matter how high its regeneration ability was, it wouldn't be able to grow a new head. Jin, with difficulty, passed the third test, once in the waiting room. As expected, he was able to regain his hand. It was strange to feel his hand again. It was like he'd never lost it. First of all, Jin decided to test his fighting ability, and she was fine. This opens up new possibilities for Jin, the guardian spirit he had gotten in the cave after passing the third test. Indeed, a spirit consistency so dense that it was no comparison to the monsters he had absorbed before. Jin's mastery level, necromancy ability, has reached 100%. Jin is now able to not only absorb enemy souls, but also their skills. Just like how he was only able to get accelerated regeneration after having to be on the cusp of death several times. In his entire life, the thought of being assigned such a unique characteristic had never once crossed his mind. But Jin noticed that obtaining the skill was only possible, not guaranteed. This is his third time back in the waiting room, so the environment feels so familiar to him, as if he were at home. Meanwhile, the chat room was bursting with messages. One of the survivors learned that the fourth trial would be a pairing. Since we're talking about a competition between hunters, wouldn't that mean killing each other? That's the question. Jin couldn't believe his eyes. He was ready for any monster, but he could kill a man. After 2 hours, all players receive the rules for the next mission. It will start in 24 hours. The condition for successful completion of the joint challenge is to defeat the Goblin King within the allotted time. In case of defeat, the entire team of 3 players will die. All 3 of them felt a terrible sense of unease. After all, they had been going through the mission alone the whole time, and many of them hadn't even spoken for weeks. Suddenly, one of them said, "Since we're a team, how about we introduce ourselves to each other?" It was suggested by a girl named Lee Ha. She specializes in team support. She's also an E-ranked hunter on the outside. This guy named Lee Seong, He specializes in close combat and is a D-rang hunter. By all lengths, their team doesn't suck that much. It was time for Jin to introduce himself. When Li Xiang found out that Jin was still studying at the academy, he told him to stay out of his way. Jin had long since gotten used to this kind of stare. For a moment, he forgot about that nightmare. Before the fight started, Li Xiang said that if Jin interfered with them, he would kill him. But Jin was sure that his ability would be enough to shut him up. After all, in the Tower of Trials, everything is decided by skills, not ranks and other unnecessary nonsense. The main theme of this challenge was a 3-on-3 competition. So, as much as they didn't want to, they would have to work together. As soon as their team entered the fortress, small goblins came at them from all sides. They weren't a threat in themselves, but when there were so many of them, you had to be on your guard. Just as suddenly Li Song shouted, "What are you doing? Are you thinking of doing anything at all?" In the time since Li Sleep had been howling like a little girl, Jin had already decapitated 3 goblins without too much pathos or shouting. Li Kan, she tried her best to help the dream. She's been strengthening it with her spells all this time. But her mana level was running low, when all of a sudden Jin said, "Li Ha, looks like this idiot needs help, so I'll leave you two alone for a while. It's time for the genie to show what he can do. He may think he's an underachiever. Well, after saving his life, he'll change his mind." Li Ha, I couldn't believe Jin did that. After all, he left his backside uncovered, and now she had to keep an eye on it. Well, when she turned around, she saw that Jin had finished it. He'd killed every goblin that could attack Li Ha. One of the goblins even managed to disarm the dream. So much for D-rank hunters. In real combat, they can't do anything. Without his weapon, Whether Sleep is incapable of anything. He was by now ready to accept death. Seconds before he was killed, he screamed, "Why am I so unlucky to be on the same team as a cadet?" He couldn't stop thinking about what would happen to him after he died. But this cadet just saved his hunting head. Jin took one of the goblins on the fly, and raised his head, and in a trembling voice tried to say something. But Jin stopped him and said, "Oh great hunter Lidriama, stay back." He couldn't believe his eyes. He couldn't bear the thought that an ordinary cadet was stronger than he was. While the members of his team were stunned and shocked, Jin single-handedly took out a whole crowd of goblins, without even being injured. Black smoke, his unique characteristic, remains indispensable to others. So he can absorb souls as much as he wants, and without any problems. Consuming all the goblins, Jin increased his stats. But most interestingly, he gained 1 Goblin Guardian skill. The skill increases the viewing area. It makes it easier to see the approaching object. Amazingly, Jin could see what was happening exactly sideways as well as straight ahead. In other words, his vision had been raised to a new level. It's safe to say that the genie has once again hit the jackpot. When it was over, the dream said, "Cadet, I see good luck is on your side. But whatever it was, you did a good job." Waiting for this Brad to end, Jin took charge of the operations and ordered us to move in vanguard. He felt this formation would be of the greatest benefit to the team, and to solidify his position as the ringleader. He asked if it was clear, without the slightest objection, agreed to Jin's terms. He realized that Jin was much stronger than all of them put together. The only assignment Jin had given Li Sleep was guarding Li Ha and nothing else. Li Ha was to provide support and orientation on the ground. In short, to do the same thing as the case before. Li Ha, like a real assist, had the ability to detect and capture a target, so using it to find the right goblin would be easy. There were more than a dozen goblins in their path, but all their souls were taken. Their team has already spent half the allotted time on this mission. Although the goblin had been attacked at various intervals, but now everything was too quiet. And that was highly suspicious, when suddenly something interesting caught Jin's eye. Without a word, he ran forward like a madman. What did Jin see that was so interesting? The thing was that thanks to his new skill, Jin could see a kind of fountain from afar. This meant that it would be possible to get some water without spending experience points. But on the way to the source, Jin's attention was drawn to the goblin corpses, which they didn't leave behind, which means their rivals were already here. Well, the monster's blood was still warm. That means if they hurry, they can catch up. If the other team wins, their failing team will face death. Death will await them, which is why they need to hurry, and if necessary, even delay their competitors. Even more, hampered in their missions by endless waves of goblins. But luckily, the goblins attacked not only the genie and his crew, but their competitors. But giving up wasn't something Jin was in the habit of doing. You have to admit that their competitors are much stronger than them. After all, besides being able to talk with their tongues, they are also able to kill monsters. This guy could single-handedly kill more than one squad of goblin guards, who's not to be underestimated. The other members of the team were not particularly skilled, but the Hannem's skills alone were enough. Team Hannem was the first to reach the boss gate, but that didn't mean they won. They had yet to win. But as they approached the gate, they received a notice saying that the conditions had been met, and all team members had entered the Goblin King's spire. But that's not the best part. The boss fight will only start when only one of the two teams is left. Until then, it will be impossible to get out of the infernal barrier. Apparently, there will be a battle between the teams. But it didn't take long for Jin and his team to arrive. They arrived just half a minute after the barrier appeared, even though Jin didn't receive this notice. But he realized that he would have to fight with other players. So before the fight started, he said that he would fight alone. Jin asked Li Ha only to increase his agility, and all other enhancements to give to Li's sleep, in all the time they spent together. Li Ha, Jin was strong. Well, maybe humans will be scarier than any monster they've ever met before. After all, you can expect anything from humans. And if Jin is in a life-threatening situation, he will immediately signal. Until then, he'll be counting on the support of his team. With increased agility, Jin has a good chance of winning. Li Ha was only able to increase Jin's agility by 2 points, and the effect would only last for 10 minutes. Jin was convinced that he had already surpassed the skill level of the average hunter. In addition, he had just killed over 100 goblins, so dealing with another team shouldn't be too much of a problem. The current Jin is strong enough to handle this challenge. And unlike the other players, Jin doesn't know the word surrender. If, in the past, Jin was against killing people, now he'd do anything to survive. The tower changes people a lot. In it, even a pessimist will take up arms, and a vegetarian will eat meat. Here, everyone is willing to do whatever is necessary for their survival. But attacking an entire team by yourself is reckless, no matter how confident you are. The tower trial teach some serious life lessons. If you think you're the strongest and most invincible, you're wrong. Well, that's a lesson the genie has yet to learn. But not this time. Jin's sword, without much trouble, destroyed the competitor's defense barrier. Breaking through their defense, Jin immediately made -1, their opponent's team immediately losing their shield. Li Ha and Li Dream knew that Jin was incredibly strong, but they didn't even expect this from him. It's one thing to break through a defense, but to kill one of the team members at once is unbelievable. Jin, quickly identifying the strongest of his opponents, and unleashed a barrage of lightning-fast attacks. Weird. His skills are clearly inferior to Jin's, but he easily deflects all of his attacks. In that case, the genie should act more decisively. A significant metric in which Jin surpassed his opponent was speed agility, so he chose to focus his attacks on those metrics, but he was unable to take the enemy by surprise. Hannem had one great advantage over the genie, and that was his combat experience. Jin didn't understand how Hannem was able to dodge his attack. Even with a lot of combat experience, it was almost impossible to do so. But in a moment, Jin saw his eyes glowing bright red flames. Jin immediately realized that Hannem had the ability to anticipate the movements of the blade, and Jin knew that to win an opponent with any advantage, you can only do so much by taking away his strengths. By throwing his shield, Jin blocked Hannem's entire field of vision, thus depriving him of his advantage. Realizing that some fraction of a second the enemy would not be able to read it, Jin decided to attack. And I have to admit, it paid off. Jin's blade had reached its target, as soon as the first drop of Hannem blood hit the floor. Jin was notified that he had completed a special task, and the reward for completing the 4th stage would be a bonus. Li Ha saw that something was wrong with Jin. He was shaking like he was having a panic attack. He seems to be in a state of shock over the murder he just committed. Li Ha thought he was a strong, cold-blooded, and ruthless person. She didn't expect that killing a man would have such an effect on him. Suddenly, Jin said, "You don't mind going and fighting the boss right now." He tried to hide his real emotions, but he was not very good at it. His team saw this, so without a second thought, they decided to support their captain in the boss battle. The Goblin King was not as strong as the players thought. Killing him turned out to be easier than killing Hannem. Killing the Goblin King meant passing the 4th stage of the tower. As a reward for this, all of Jin's stats increased by 4 points, and as a bonus reward, he received the skill of instant acceleration. Before going to the waiting room, Li Dream said, "Cadet, you're a real monster," and entered his portal first, leaving Li Ha and Jin alone, before they dispersed to their portals. Li Ha said, "Look, perhaps my words are out of place, but you only did what you should have done. Jin, I want you to know I'm not judging you. In fact, I think you're a hero. Someone needed to kill the opposing team anyway. If you refused, I would have joined the fight." It was very important for Jin to hear those words. With a wave of her hand, Licha sent his wife a friend request. Before, no one even paid attention to Jin, let alone wanted to be friends with him. Before entering her portal, Licha said, "You could say that we passed the 4th test because of your power. That's why I felt like I was in another one in front of you. In the future, when you return to Earth, find a Ha from the White Guild, and then I'll pay you back." After these words, Licha entered the portal, leaving his wife alone with her thoughts. Now that he's alone, he has to make a decision, whether to consume a man's soul or not. It would seem that the answer is obvious. When the genie was sure he was capable of something like this, he postponed the absorption process until later, because he felt he was about to cross an irreversible line. But now he was determined, even though he has no intention of killing people to make himself stronger. But in a situation where he has no choice, he's willing to kill. Beyond his very first desire to become a hunter, a new ambition had already begun to germinate in his soul. The Tower of Trials gave him a chance, which he decided to take full advantage of. Jin will climb to the top of this tower no matter what it takes. After Jin's 4th trial, he needs to get some rest. But as soon as he entered the waiting room, the system informed him that there would be a ranking system among all the players. Before appearing in this table, you must make up a name, which may not coincide with your real name. Without thinking long, Jin appeared in the rankings under the nickname Hunter. His place in the rankings was much better than he had imagined. But that's not all. Those players who make it into the top 50 will be labeled as first-timers, and they will get an advantage during the 8th challenge. But to get that advantage, you have to make it to the 8th challenge without dropping out of the best player list. But it's too soon to think about all that. We must at least live to see the ordeal. And in Jin's inventory, there were a few more souls, which he has decided to absorb now. Now he feels he's completely overstepped the bounds of human possibility. And since Jin has reached the 5th trial, he has access to the Stone of Return. This stone allows the player to leave the Tower of Trials for 3 days. But if the player refuses to return, he will be killed. Because Jin had no family or friends, the only reason he wanted to return to the real world was to see if he would still have his abilities and inventory. And this is the moment of truth. Jin returns to Earth. He prayed to all the gods that his powers would remain on Earth. The process of returning to Earth is not a pleasant one. Finally, Jin was home again. Not that he didn't like the waiting room, but home is home. He's got 3 days to do all his scheduled errands. Well, as such, he had no plans. So the first thing he wanted to do was sleep. But sleep was drowned out by a horrible armpit odor. But his first order of business was to wash up. And then we'll see, but when he wanted to get out of bed, his foot stepped on something iron. When he lowered his head, he saw that the shield and sword he had gotten in the dungeon had returned to the ground with him. Jin, until the last moment, doubted that he would be able to take the items from the Tower of Trials with him. Well, as we can see, it's quite possible, which means that other survivors can also take items from the tower. So you need to be as quick as you can. Soon, the number of returnees will increase, leading to a dramatic increase in items, and a drop in the value of Hunter's equipment on the market. So Gina decided to get rid of his items as soon as possible. The problem is that only those with Hunter qualifications can sell items on the market. Jin's original plan was just to apply for the Hunter's exam and pass it on his next return. But he had a lot more to do than he thought. In order to pass the exam, Jin should have called his former sponsor. Don't even listen to Gina the curator say, "Why don't you apply for a refund online?" But Jin, instead of picking up his papers from the academy, he asked me to register him for the exam. The genie offered the curator a deal. The curator was to arrange for the genie to take the Hunter's qualification exam today, and we'll find out what the curator gets in return later. Taking a shower, Jin couldn't help but notice how, in proportion to his progress, his body had changed. His muscles had increased by a factor of 3. Now it's time for me to admire myself. Jin has arranged to take the exam, so he should hurry up. Stepping out of his apartment, Jin met a neighbor. At this moment, he was overwhelmed with all sorts of emotions. The normal, everyday life that he missed so much, that it even pleased him to see his neighbors passing by. In an unaccustomed manner, Jin decided to say hello to this girl. A little confused, but the girl reciprocated. As he left, Jin wished her a good day. The girl noticed that Jin had changed. She just couldn't figure out how. For 10 minutes, Jin stood outside trying to hail a cab to get to the academy. All the passing cars ignored him. After thinking for a while, Jin decided to get to the academy on his own, especially since his speed index had increased by many times. With the speed at which Jin ran, he would reach the academy faster even than by car. Jin was greeted at the entrance to the academy by his mentor Manhwa. Suddenly Jin said, "Long time no see, instructor. It's good to see you." The instructor only smiled and replied, "For me to say that it has been a long time since we last met. But in the last few weeks, there's been so many changes to the Jin, it feels like it's been years." A few minutes after Jin arrived at the academy, Mr. In-hoo came out to see him. He is the examiner who will be grading his test. In-hoo said that Jin would not have to take a theory test or go through an interview. At the request of instructor Manhwa, Jin passed the theoretical knowledge and interviews a long time ago, back in his first year at the academy. It turns out that the genie only needs to pass the practical part of the exam. More specifically, he has to kill a monster. For a genie, it shouldn't be a big problem. But In-hoo had prepared for him a monster with the worst compatibility with the examinee. Usually don't release this monster at graduation. It's used for rank promotion. Before the exam begins, must select the monster's difficulty level from 1 to 10. Jin had always chosen the first difficulty level on this exam before. But even so, every time he lost to the most common goblin. Well, this time, as suddenly Jin shouted to the entire training room, "I choose the 10th level of difficulty," and the monster he'd been prepared for was a firebird. Indeed, for an ordinary cadet, it was an extremely heavy monster. Firebird possesses the raptor's roar skill, which slows its opponent by 25%. Not only that, the examiner gave the genie a defective sword. He only did it out of a personal dislike for the genie. He thought he was trash, who didn't understand where he belonged in the world. With low speed and bad weapons, it will be hard enough to defeat such a monster. But it's gonna be hard on the average cadet, or a low-ranking hunter, which Jin has already outgrown. Having finally become a hunter, he felt like he was the best. Gradually, however, the gap with his peers began to widen. Eventually, he gave up trying to bridge the gap. The hunter's world is based on innate talent. He accepted that fact and stopped trying to change anything. People have to give up when they feel a wall in front of them that they can't overcome. And it's not just him. Everyone does it. That's why the curator treated the genie the way he did. He felt that since Jin had no innate powers, all his efforts to become the greatest hunter were in vain. But Jin was not a timid man. It was not in his nature to give up. After repulsing the firebird's first attack, his sword shattered. Jin realized, if it was a low-level weapon, there was no way it could crack with such ease. Putting 2 plus 2 together, Jin immediately realized that this was the coaster the curator had arranged. Well, to be honest, Jin's glad things turned out this way. It was the perfect situation to test his skills. He managed to get his hands on during the 4th trial. And the first thing he wanted to do was try his wife. Instant acceleration. The genie was able to fly up to the ceiling. Instant acceleration. Much better than the speed increase when using the assassin's cloak, because it allows Jin to defy the laws of physics for a while. Genie, already anxious to get this monster over with and look at the face of the curator and examiner. Even though the genie didn't have the entire sword, but even a small shard of it easily pierced the bird's eye. Jin knew, because the sword was too short, it didn't hit the bird's brain, which meant it was still alive. But the exam is only successfully completed when the monster dies. The tower experience taught Jin how to improvise during combat, and to use the environment to his advantage. Throws a slab of concrete right at the bird's head. He splits it in 2. Well, even with the monster's head bashed in, the slab didn't stop. Only a reinforced concrete wall could stop that projectile. He was defeated, so the exam should be considered successfully completed. When things had calmed down a bit, Jin asked, "Are you okay in there? I didn't expect the stove to hit you." Of course it was a lie. He knew it would happen. Or rather, he wanted it to happen. Jin finally got his hunter's license. The exam results gave him a C rank, and the title of Melee Master. Since Jin was registered with the Hunters Association, he can now officially engage in hunting activities. More specifically, the genie is allowed to enter the dungeon and sell items. Meanwhile, the instructor was furious, asking for an explanation of what just happened during Jin's exam, because In-hoo promised him that Jin would fail the exam within 10 seconds. But it turned out to be the opposite. In defense of that pathetic idiot, he did everything in his power to make Jin fail the exam. I understand. The whole hopelessness of the situation was screamed out by the curator. "Okay, monster, could you at least give him a lower rank?" Well, to be honest, the rank he was given was too low. In fact, Jin is an S-ranked hunter. Jin walked into the break room and found Yoon-soo and In-hoo talking. Walking up to his former handler, he said, "You don't look so good. Is something wrong?" Hiding his annoyance to the young man said it was all right, and congratulated the genie on getting his hunter's pass. Sighing heavily, Jin said, "Before you retired, you reached the rank of C, didn't you? Here's the thing, I was just thinking about how you said you thought I was trash. And suddenly the thought popped into my head that maybe you are in fact the dumpster. Because it was true." Jin, pressing down on a long-standing wound that had never healed. Deep down, the curator thought he was nothing. Against Jin's expectations, he easily fell for his provocation. Of course, with his current numbers, dealing with a hunter like the handler would be easy for Jin, and he only provoked him to make it look like self-defense. And Jin had a plan to punish the curator a long time ago. But it wasn't until new opportunities came along that it became a reality, and the final point of their fight. Jin decided to deliver a humiliating slap. With this blow, he stripped his former teacher of his pride and self-respect. This day was already beautiful. How suddenly Mr. Insu offered Jin a job in the Hunters Association with a salary of 1 billion won. And the best part is, they can raise it even more for Jin. If he takes him up on his offer, it's a win-win. A salary like that, Jin didn't think about, he couldn't even dream about. As Jin suddenly said, "You know, it seems to me that the difficulty level of the exam has been adjusted by someone. Well, I won't make a big deal out of it. But it's not my policy to make deals with people I don't trust." Jin spent the remaining 2 days of his vacation at home. The other hunters couldn't keep their mouths shut, and now the whole world knows about the Tower of Trials. Good or bad, it's too early to tell. After getting his hunter's license, Jin was able to sell his equipment for a very good price. He's going to buy an even better one with the proceeds. Meanwhile, my time at home was coming to an end. Time's up. And Jin once again returns to the Tower of Trials. When he returns, he'll have another bump in the road. But it's good to see that he can get even stronger. A moment later, Jin was back on his bed in the waiting room. As Jin had suspected, moving objects between the tower and reality was quite possible. You just have to figure out how to make the most of it. After resting at home, Jin was overflowing with energy and strength. He decided to stretch a little first, and then challenge himself to the 5th test. Suddenly, Jin received a game notification stating that he had received a new title of the first return. And with it, he received a new skill, the Eye of Truth. The Eye of Truth allows you to gain information about the target you're watching in return for giving up a small amount of mana. And also, this skill allows you to determine if your opponent's words are true, in addition to detailed information about the enemy. Jin got a built-in lie detector. With the proceeds, Jin purchased a new sword. It is an extremely formidable weapon in the hands of a professional. And with the rest, Jin bought a Hunter Scout shield. The advantages of this shield are its lightweight and high durability, even though Jin had given almost a fortune for the Thunder Sword. But after seeing its characteristics, he couldn't do otherwise. This sword has a 10% chance to summon lightning when it strikes an enemy. Having bought everything he needed, Jin decided to set out for the 5th challenge. The theme of the 5th challenge was hunting. The condition for successfully completing the challenge is defeating the boss. The reward for successfully completing a mission is a werewolf headband. And according to the classics, if you lose, the person dies. Jin was very interested in this challenge. As a veteran, he'd never seen a werewolf, let alone fought one. As in previous times, just by appearing a pack of mobs swooped down on Jin. Well, for a genie, regular mobs are no longer a competitor. It's amazing how CeeLo in a few weeks, life can change. With that level of agility, their fight was more like a chase. Now the genie is even having fun with the trials. He even had this obsessive thought that he was going crazy. After finishing off an entire pack of wolves, Jin upgraded his Hunter's Dagger skill to E rank, accelerated regeneration skill to D rank. The Hunter's Dagger skill has almost reached its growth limit, so the genie urgently needed to get a new swordsmanship skill. Jin had already hunted 3 times during his time in this ordeal, and it turns out the lightning sword effect is rarer than he'd imagined. But by absorbing all the souls of the mad wolves he'd killed before, his skill increased by 16%. The skill of the unique characteristic is also steadily increasing. If Jin gives his best, he will be able to achieve a rank increase in the necromancy skill. Meanwhile, Jin was already halfway to the main werewolf in this gorge. But on the way there, Jin met a pack of wolves, but no longer alive, figuring there'd been a misunderstanding in the pack. But upon examining their wounds, Jin realized that the blows were inflicted with a sword, and the other footprints in the vicinity only confirm his assumption. But better, make sense of the whole situation with the Eye of Truth skill. Thanks to this science, Jin learned that the trace left after the strong aura neatly split the wall. I wonder if aura is also one of the skills. The genie felt uneasy about the whole situation. There were too many nuances that didn't fit in his head. When suddenly, there was a loud howl throughout the gorge. Realizing that it was close by, Jin decided to go there immediately. It was a wild roar coming from a lonely cave, which could very well have been inhabited, when all of a sudden, out of this cave comes flying. But it didn't look like it was attacking. Apparently the boss werewolf is dead. More questions arose in Jin's mind. After all, he thought he was in the pack alone. Jin's fears were confirmed by a game notification that said a boss werewolf had died as a condition of passing the challenge. When it saw the error in the trial, the system analyzed it and found that Jin's trial had been invaded. The purpose of his trial had been changed. At this point, Jin had so many questions he couldn't find an answer to. When suddenly, out of the darkness of the cave, a strange warrior from another dimension appeared. And now the goal of Jin's test was to kill him. That's, interesting enough. I mean, considering this warrior came from another dimension, does this mean that the Tower of Trials exists simultaneously in several dimensions besides Earth? Even if that's true. How did he get into Jin's dimension, when all of a sudden, it was yours, he said. Are you still alive? I didn't expect something like that from a challenger from a less evolved world. So you are the master of this ordeal. The appearance of this warrior was indeed frightening. But the genie didn't care about that. Jin never thought that a situation would arise where the target of his trial would be killed by an invader from another dimension. Nevertheless, he was very lucky that the trial didn't fail because of it. Judging by the fighting stance, a warrior from another dimension, it will combine the attacks of a damage dealer and a tank. Well, Gina, there's a slight advantage to him. The warrior from another dimension severely underestimates him. To fight such a warrior in the open would be suicide. So Jin devised a plan. And the first step in executing it was to divert the enemy's attention. Wow, that's yours. Very strong indeed. With one swing of his sword, he cut the werewolf boss's body in half. To divert the enemy's attention, Jin took advantage of his speed advantage and decided to attack him from the rear. The fight could be considered over, if it weren't for one thing. The Thunder Sword couldn't even scratch this warrior's armor. Jin had planned to cut his armor in half with this blow. Wife, I need to come up with a new plan, given what I've learned. On top of that, yours was a lot faster than the genie thought. Jin was able to block his blow with his shield, which turned out to be a one-time thing. One more hit like that, Jin wouldn't survive. The truth is, even though Jin was able to block that punch, he almost died. Consequences. Meeting the stone wall, Jin broke his left arm. Now it would be nearly impossible to fight at full strength, when suddenly, a warrior from another dimension says, "Wow, you managed to block my aura. But it's worse for you. If you had surrendered, I would have allowed you a quick and painless death." Of Jin's former confidence was gone. In a panic, he shouted, "The system recognized you as an intruder. How could that be? I've never heard of anything like that." But the warrior just laughed and said, "How on earth would Varvar know about floor implementation anyway? Anyway, it looks like the genie's gonna have to fight to the last drop of blood. Don't hold a grudge. The tower was originally such an unpredictable place. Well, let's leave the long talk. It's time to do the honors," added the warrior from the other dimension. Well, before entering the fray again, Jin asked this warrior to tell him about the floor infiltration, thinking he'd already won. The warrior agreed to tell Jin everything he knows. Among the system options whose extension goes from the 8th floor, there is the so-called floor implementation. If you buy a ticket for floor implementation at the store, you get to meddle in other people's trials. But Jin didn't stop asking questions. And this time he asked him if he was really from another dimension, to which he received a positive answer. But to be sure he would be allowed to do so, the Eye of Truth, but with work, or this skill on wars from another dimension is not known. Surprisingly, the skill worked, and it turned out that this warrior was indeed from another dimension. "Now, you have committed an extremely unpleasant act. How dare you judge my words and actions," the warrior added. But Jin just smiled in the face of his death. Jin had gotten the information, so he decided to share a fun fact with the warrior. Thanks to his pain tolerance skill, his injured arm is barely bothering him at all. In other words, he didn't hold it up because he was in unbearable pain, but only because if he lets her go, she'll fall off. That's lucky. Thanks to accelerated regeneration, the hand is back where it belongs. Jin, hiding his regeneration on purpose, because he thought the warrior would share the information with him. If he saw Jin dying, a warrior from another dimension. That surprised me, but not frightened. With a wave of his sword, he said, "Well, be that as it may. If your strength lies only in what you demonstrated earlier, you cannot escape death. Well, Gina, there were still a few aces up her sleeve, thanks to the stockpile of souls Jin had absorbed earlier. Jin had increased all of his stats several times. The warrior from another dimension said with surprise, "Besides the healing skill, you also have a unique characteristic? You're much more interesting than I thought." It's time for Gina to start fighting at full strength. In combination with Assassin's Cloak, instant acceleration skill allows the genie to move at the speed of sound. For a warrior from another dimension, this was a real surprise. After all, he had expected to meet a pathetic loser, using his greatest advantage, which is his speed. Jin began to attack him from all sides. Those attacks didn't do much damage, but they did exhaust him, which means their speed gap will widen even more. With that advantage, Jin doesn't even need a shield. He can just dodge all of his attack. Jin realized that Aura was a high-level skill. Therefore, such a blow could kill him. However, Jin is definitely ahead of him statistically. Therefore, he can easily avoid critical hits. The real problem lies in his armor. It's a high-level piece of equipment that can't be destroyed just like that. After all, this armor is made of hardened steel from magical caves. However, if Jin continued to continuously strike after strike, the hidden sword skill would be triggered. Well done! After another series of lightning attacks, the sword was still able to launch lightning at the warrior from another dimension. Because his armor is made of magical metal, it's highly conductive. A skill that worked just in the nick of time. The kind of acceleration from the Assassin's Cloak will last no more than 10 seconds. If his armor had the function of a lightning rod, it would have given the genie a lot of trouble. Well, luckily, his risk was completely worth it. Of course, the lightning strike didn't completely kill the war from another dimension. But he could no longer continue to fight at full strength. But more importantly, he was starting to panic. After all, the challenger in front of him was just a challenger from the 5th trial. In a whisper, he asked Jin how he got such a huge amount of skills. "You're really stupid if you relied on your one single high-level skill in armor for the whole thing," replied Jin. Now it was his time to meet his maker. But at the last moment, he cried out, "Stop! I can give you the answers to all your questions." But Gina wasn't interested in the offer, because if he lets him live, he'll fail his mission, and he'll pay for it with his life. Each time, it gets easier and easier for him to take someone's life. But if, piercing someone else's swim, he felt uncomfortable, that would be a far more serious problem. When suddenly, the breathless body of this warrior began to vaporize. Apparently, after death, they returned to their own dimension. At the last moment, Jin manages to absorb his soul. He has not lost her too, the most powerful soul in his arsenal. Absorbed, he learned that his opponent's name was Kaida Adraxa, and thanks to his soul, Jin's skill had increased to 15%. Its news couldn't be happier. Well, the reward message didn't come. A couple minutes later, Jin received a notification that the reward and difficulty level of the challenge did not match. Therefore, the award was completely revised. Instead of the promised C-rank reward, Jin received a skill 3 absolutes. It was a rank A skill, and the additional reward Jin received was 11,000 points. The invading warrior must have been quite strong, since the system considered the difficulty of the test he passed to be much higher than the original one. The genie still couldn't believe that he had managed to pull off the A-rank skill. Back in the waiting room, Jin began to analyze what had happened. He came to the conclusion that the Tower of Trials really knew how to take people by surprise. Jin tried his best to save his question submission ticket until the 8th test, but he had a large number of questions that he needed an answer to. The first thing Jin wanted to know was more about the floor infiltration, and whether it was possible to find out in advance if an invasion was imminent. Surprisingly, after only a few seconds, Jin received a reply. From the letter, Jin learned that floor implementation is a system that allows a player to enter the trial of a challenger with whom they have a gap of no more than 10 trials. However, implementation is only possible in single trials. It is only available from the 8th trial. Basically, floor implementation is like breaking the arms and legs of a drowning player. But for the second question, Jin got an answer. That this information is not available at this stage. Since the request was only half satisfied, the ticket for submitting the question was returned. It turns out that even these tickets are not all powerful. Still, Jin was glad his ticket stayed with him. Now it was time to use the items Jin had brought with him from Earth. From the ground, the genie brought with him a chest of recovery from the Kroken Magic Tower. Thanks to this chest, Jin was able to restore his Scout Hunter shield. But now, he can only use it once. But that's not all Jin took with him. Back home, He bought a stone of purity. At first glance, buying this stone might seem like a waste of money, but Jin felt that it was not ashamed to pay a couple thousand won for the feeling of freshness and vigor that comes after bathing. There was a little over an hour left before the next challenge began. Gina decided to make the most of this time and look at the ranking table. At the end of the 5th trial, Jin ranks 3rd among all players. This position brings Jin closer to the possibility of a first mover advantage. The main thing is not to lose your place for the next trials. Jin was horrified when he entered the chat room. It was literally chaos and disorder in front of him. All the players were eager to kill. Some players offered to buy their skills. One of them was the mental resistance skill. This skill allows you to temporarily get rid of the mental shock. But even if every time you use the skill to dull the mental pain, the essence of the problem, it will not change. When suddenly, Genie sees a message saying that the player who made the information about the trials public has changed his name to Gon. And since we're talking about a competition between hunters, it's going to be a real slaughter between each other. Jeans knew exactly which player he was talking about, the veteran he'd met before. And he was trying to pit the survivors against each other. So the name is gone, Jin remembered very well. And so the rest of the hour flew by, reading the chat room. But it was time to go to the 6th challenge, and the theme of this trial was occupation. The condition for successful completion of the trial is the capture of one or more strongholds. The terrain resembled a spider's web of bridges and pontoons. Jin was very surprised that this time they would have to fight in the sea. But that's not all the surprises. This challenge is also done in teams. It was very strange because his teammates' portals were open, but no one was coming out. As suddenly, out of one of the portals appeared like his, which was clearly aimed at Jin's head. But you couldn't catch him with a cheap trick like that. Jin grabbed the spear and forcefully pulled his partner out of the portal. After knocking him to the floor, Jin said, attacking members of his own team, "What are you even doing?" When suddenly this guy says, "Fool, if you've been in the community, you should know what's going on. Killing is the easiest way to gain skills," added the boy. After listening to these pathetic cries, Jin said, "Are you saying that the most important thing for you is to earn as many achievements as possible? And in what way it doesn't matter, right?" Apparently, Jin's words went right over this guy's head. Suddenly he shouted, "You're the best look around!" And all around, there was a real horror going on. Players were killing each other without a second thought. Some were actually killing members of their own team, who didn't see this coming. Jin was so shocked by what was happening that he was speechless. Apparently the warriors from another dimension were right. Humans on Earth are nothing more than barbarians. As the sea slowly began to turn red from the blood, the genie was once again convinced that humans were scarier than monsters. Even those who didn't intend to kill their partners decided to do it for survival. But there were those who were more cunning. At first, rubbing confidence in your partner by pretending to be like-minded. And then when he loses his guard, mercilessly takes his life, like some kind of pig. Players like that are the biggest threat, because they'll do anything to get you to trust them and end up stabbing you in the back. Of course, the system didn't care who the player killed. They'd still get their enhancements. Seeing everything that was going on around him, Jin was speechless. His partner, on the other hand, kept his mouth shut. He talked more and more about how everyone wanted to get the skills no matter what it took, while Jin was distracted by what was going on around him. This guy decided to attack him. It was reckless of him to attack a player who had easily dodged a surprise attack. But for his stupidity, he paid the price. Killing his partner gave Jin the title of traitor, and increased his strength by 1 point. As unfortunate as it may sound. But that guy was right. And this challenge was more like a special event created for the genie, where he can upgrade his unique characteristics. If he's lucky, maybe he'll get a couple of new skills too. However, Jin wasn't going to specifically attack other survivors. He would simply perform the conditional trials and fight whoever decided to attack first. In this test, only magicians with water elemental powers had an advantage. Because of it, they can change the environment around them and create protective barriers to capture points.